The Frick situation is a little bit different, I think, because we're actually moving our collection twice in the last few years. So I'm going to be talking about a recent change, and we're actually in the middle, again, of a new one. I hope many of you have had a first-hand experience of the Frick in New York, but for those who haven't, I'll just try to describe it a little bit. Nestled in at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 70th Street in Manhattan, the Frick offers a unique experience in New York City. It's a collection of only 2,500 objects. So if you think about 700,000 here, 2,500 objects, it creates a different kind of responsibility and a different kind of experience. The range of date is 1,300 to 1,900. This small but significant collection includes highlights like Giovanni Bellini's, this is the West Gallery, Giovanni Bellini's St. Francis in the Desert, 3 Rembrandts, 3 Vermeers, and playing to my CODART audience, 8 Van Dycks. It is a strictly European collection. So again, this does change the responsibility and the experience here. This was the private home of the steel and coke industrialist Henry Clay Frick and his family, and it was built in 1913, 1914. This is not a museum that's focused on the life of this family who lived here, so there are no beds, no hairbrushes. But the domestic setting does shape the experience of visitors who go through. So to preserve the atmosphere of a home, there are no labels, no didactic labels. You and the art. Everything can be identified. There's a maker and title, and then we offer a free app, and there are many other published literatures that you can look up every single work of art, but this is about looking and experiencing directly. The objects are displayed in an idiosyncratic way, reflecting the tastes of an individual collector. So you have Italian sculpture mixed together with German painting, with French cabinetry, and so on. There are no barriers. There's no glass on any pictures, there are no cases on any objects except those rare instances where there's a condition requirement, and that's limited to maybe 5 objects. To maintain the safety of the art and to maintain this kind of home environment, children under the age of 10 are not admitted. I know, it's not a very popular rule with, with those of us who have children under 10. And no photography is permitted in the galleries. And this is not about copyright. This is simply a safety thing, because as we know, we do love young people taking selfies, but they tend to walk backwards into things. And we have porcelain out on tables, etc. One part of the Frick's mission statement that I think is very unusual for museums is we are committed to maintaining the, quote, historic tranquility of Mr. Frick's home. Imagine that in some of your major institutions. So what happens when you separate the art from the house? So in late 2019, a piece of plaster fell from the soaring ceiling of the West Gallery. No one was hurt, but it fell next to a Scandinavian tourist who, I think in true Scandinavian fashion, just looked over and walked away. It was not a big deal. But it was clear that this 100-year-old building needed some work, and plans had already been in progress for many years when in finally 2020, the Frick moved out of its buildings to begin this construction, led by Annabelle Seldorf. And today, standing here 4 years later, I'm happy to say that we are in the process of moving back to the renovated mansion. But during construction, and this was in 2020 in the midst of COVID, we moved into a temporary space, and we moved into a full building, the Breuer Building, just 5 blocks north on Madison Avenue. This is a project we called Frick Madison, built in 1966 by Marcel Breuer for the Whitney Museum of American Art. So it's a purpose-built modern museum. It's a concrete temple to minimalism, and it provided office space for all our staff, storage for everything, and 3 floors of galleries for our art. And in fact, we were subletting from the Met, who was leasing from the Whitney, who recently sold the building to Sotheby's. So it was a very New York real estate story. So we were not looking for a modernist setting for our old master art. We were not. The choice of this building was practical. We needed a place to go. And Breuer's excessively and aggressively brutalist architecture, here's a couple of interior views, it became an unexpected challenge. A white cube actually would have been easier, I think. And one of the challenges is that some people, maybe some of you here, hate this kind of architecture. And that includes a previous president of the United States of America who actually filed an executive order barring all federal buildings from being built in this style. But President Biden revoked that. That's another story. Some of our longtime patrons, and even some of our most generous patrons, they wanted us to recreate the interiors of the Frick in this building to just pretend that nothing has changed. We've just moved some blocks up. And I should say that all of the interior walls of the Breuer building are temporary. So you really must shape the space for what you are going to put in it. So meanwhile, we curators, we saw this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to experience the collection in a way that it's never been seen and probably will never be seen again. We wanted to retain something, though, of the uniqueness of the Frick, because it's a very precious identity that no other place in New York City has. We didn't want to lose it entirely. So direct, intimate experience was what we were trying to retain. And people shared many opinions about how we could battle Breuer's architecture, make curved walls, put really bright colors in, just pretend a little bit that there's a battle going on and that you might be able to win. Those trapezoidal windows, he designed it for contemporary art, so already bringing in anything from 1300 to 1900 made so long ago was already going to be cacophonic in this space. So in the end, we decided to, just to give you another couple of, there were many ways we could have done this. And it was one of the very first challenges was thinking how to organize this collection, which is all mixed up and jumbled in the house. How do we organize that in a place that has a grid that is unrelenting? We decided to surrender to Breuer. We surrendered to the architecture. We used only colors that were already there in the building, so the seas of grays. All the temporary walls follow the grid. And any of the finishes, so for example, in some of the pedestals for our bronzes, any of the finishes we're only taking from the building itself, so the concrete, the wood banisters, the tile on the floor, that kind of thing. So we sorted by school. It's a very conservative thing to do, but actually for the Frick, no one had seen this before, how many actually Flemish paintings we have, how many Italian pictures we have, gold grounds, et cetera. And for the first time, the three Vermeers were isolated in one room together. I know that doesn't sound like a big deal, but for some reason, people love being in rooms surrounded by Vermeer only. And this was one of the most popular things. People would just sit on that bench and say, oh, Vermeer. We retained our rules. No barriers. No glass, no children under 10, no photography. And again, this was a different audience for whom those rules were very hard to understand and to appreciate and to follow. It was not an easy transition, especially for our security staff. So we retained the, quote, historic tranquility of Mr. Frick's house in a modern museum. And our old masters looked like they had never before, and they were charged a little bit with this brutalist intensity. And some objects took on new life in this setting. So outside of the context of home, of Frick, of American taste, I'm Canadian, of money, Rembrandt's Ruts, so on the very left, his portrait of Nicholas Ruts, 1631, suddenly, out of that context, people could see it as a turning point in Rembrandt's career, a material object, which is one of the earliest European paintings made on mahogany, being shipped over from colonies in the Caribbean. So it took on sort of different stories on its own. So we weren't weaving stories through the museum. Each object suddenly projected new relationships with people coming up to it. And the Barbet Angel, which if you knew that this was in the collection, I'd be very impressed. It was in the garden. People consider it like garden decoration. But it's one of the most important early Burgundian bronzes that survives at this scale, was not melted down for artillery. Cast by a cannon founder, actually, in 1475. It's this relationship between art and war that it allowed to be told to people who knew nothing about where, point out Burgundy. And yet they could understand something about this object. It was a little bit like getting a whole new collection. I'll share just a few of the lessons we learned. There are many of them, and none of this is going to be groundbreaking or anything you don't already know. Some of it will sound obvious, but these are some of the things that really emerged for us, especially as we're moving back into a new space, into a renovated space. So we all know that changing the setting of a work of art can change the experience of it, and even familiar objects can be made very strange, but change is not always good. And one lesson was how difficult it is actually to predict how an object will act in a new setting until you're actually standing there looking at it. So we all know that paper models and computer graphics and all those things are crucial. But it's only when you're standing in front of it that you experience what that work of art can actually do in its new setting. But who is going to be the one to say, I know this worked on paper. I know we have 20 more galleries to install. I know our art handlers want to go, but this doesn't work. And so it was a bit of a reckoning. We had to be honest with ourselves, with our egos, with our standards of quality and aesthetic taste, and what we were willing to ask of each other. And that includes the labor of all of this involved. The best case scenario was something where an object that people knew very, very well suddenly became a different object. And this is the Bellini. One of my most treasured memories is of many people who sat on that bench, but especially Peter Sheldhall, who was a longtime art critic for The New Yorker. And he sat on that bench and said, I have studied this painting for 30 years, I've written about it, I have stared at it, and I'm seeing things for the very first time in it. And it was the most gratifying thing, I think, for people who knew these objects very well, that they could suddenly have a different experience of them, they could speak differently. Things that didn't work so well, the gilt frames, the very elaborate gilt frames that are kind of hidden in the house, or at least meld with the silk wall hangings, especially all my Dutch friends said they were not trying to tell me that these big frames looked monstrous against this brutalist background. And so there were, suddenly people started talking about the Rothschild and why American houses are full of these gilt frames, et cetera. Another lesson was about space, and we use space emphatically here to slow the pace of viewers, to focus attention on single objects. Outside of the ornate domestic settings of the Frick House, any weakness, however, in an object's quality, remember we only have 2,500 objects, that's 200 paintings, any weakness was laid bare. And so I felt a little bit sorry for Thomas Cromwell. These are two Holbein pictures, Thomas Cromwell on the right, which is a great painting, but with absolutely no camouflage. It just couldn't hold up to Thomas More on the left. But what was interesting was it was finally a chance for people off the street who aren't conservators to see, actually, historic objects can age very differently. There are hundreds of years of experience that individual objects, even if you're seeing them together today, journey through history. A third lesson, and it's the last one I'll mention because I know I have 12 minutes, has to do with permanence, and we've all talked about how permanence is sort of a myth in the sense of permanent collections not actually being so. Accepting that change was inevitable for us was very important to build flexibility into all of our plans. More broadly, so we've seen how museums have changed in terms of demands, needs, responsibilities, from museums becoming sites of protest, the scrutiny of board members and funding sources, the drastic physical and logistical transformations that COVID made everyone adopt. We've seen that change will come in ways that we can't anticipate. So how can we make decisions that won't restrict our future options? And this is a sustainability issue as well, of course. So that sounds big and vague, but it's in everyday things. Like initially, the Frick Madison installation was meant to just stay put for 3 years. We weren't going to pour some money into it. It was meant to stay fixed, but our circumstances changed. I mean, 3 years is a long time, and if you think back to what was happening in the museum world at that time, change needed to happen. We appreciated then the flexibility of the gallery design and even the hardware we used, like wires hanging from picture rails so that we could alter the display without excessive cost or labor, so that the same temporary walls and paint and colors could serve our permanent collection, like the British pictures here, Reynolds and Constable. as well as a temporary exhibition on Barclay L. Hendricks, who, American artist, 1960s and 70s, his portraits deeply inspired by the old masters, the Frick being his favorite institution. We were able to do this very easily because of just the flexibility of these spaces and the hardware. So anticipating these future changes also helped us when producing digital and audio content. So that really means like practices that won't make having to change one audio guide commentary, you have to like sign a new contract with an external firm for 12 months. You know, we adopted vendors and practices that made any change actually relatively easy, and that was a priority for us. Things as mundane as electric sockets. This is going to be the most boring thing I ever say at a podium. How many electric sockets and where? Because we're building new galleries, it might be a different idea that you have today where paintings will go, where picture rails will go, et cetera. It's actually a big favor you're doing to your future self and to your successors to just accept that they will have a different idea. It's an exercise, I think, in humility. We are never the final word. So to close, okay, I'm doing okay on time. The goal of the renovation project is somewhat ironically to make the Frick feel like it always did, but to be able to accommodate the evolved institution. It's a place where people think time stands still, nothing ever changes, but as we all know, much change goes on constantly. One major difference as we're going into this renovation, moving back into the renovated mansion, is that we're opening to the public for the first time the second floor, first floor European, of the mansion. So those who once stood longingly at the grand staircase can finally go up or use the elevator. This series of rooms was the private quarters of the Frick family, later administrative offices when the museum opened to the public. It's not a simple matter of just moving office furniture out and putting art back in. Over the last 90 years, these spaces have been modernized, sterilized, made very ugly. This was the sitting room on the second floor of the daughter of the Frick family. This was taken in the 1920s. It had the dubious fate of becoming my office. That's a neat day, actually. And so as we're revisiting these spaces, it's a strange challenge. We are creating new, old spaces that have never served as public gallery space before. So all of that being said, I really look forward to welcoming you all there. We can have a conversation about the lessons learned once we moved back. Thank you very much for your attention.